It's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with the Coach. We have a question from Gisha Dimitrov, who says, "Hey Ramsey, what do you think of M1 Medieval? It is a Russian combat sport with armor and swords. Do you think MMA skills would be helpful in this kind of sport?" Okay, yeah, I've seen M1 armored knight fights. It's really attention-grabbing at first. At first I was like, wow, cool, this is neat, and I took a look at it, and the medieval sword-fighting nerd inside of me immediately started thinking, but they're doing it all wrong. They're just taking a blunted sword and swinging it at each other as if it were a cudgel, and that's not the way real armored knights would have used it. Now, I don't have a European long sword right here. I do have a Chinese jin here, and it's different because this particular Chinese jin, not all of them, has a sharp blade throughout, whereas, say, the English longsword was sharp at the longer extremity, and then closer to the handle was flat, so you could actually grab it. And they would do a technique called half-swording, which, I mean, you can do it with a sharpened blade, but essentially, if you're fighting an armored dude, swinging a sharp blade isn't going to do anything. You're just going to ruin your sword. But there are little chinks in between the armor, little spaces. And so in order to get those spaces, you would do half-swording. You would grab the blade itself, and you would use this more like a dagger to find the cracks in between and dig it in there and do some real damage. And this would often result, since it's close quarters combat, in grappling. And so if you read these old medieval sword fighting codices on combat, it's quite fascinating because a great deal of what is taught in sword fighting manuals is grappling. So we've got half-swording, grappling, because as soon as it turns into a bind when the blades crossed, it's a grappling situation. Now, the jin is interesting because it's used in a number of different Chinese martial arts. You've probably heard of Tai Chi, or in Mandarin Taiji, or Taijiquan, which is the unarmed fighting style, but did you know there's also Taijijian, jin, like this? Jin is a Chinese longsword, like this, Chinese straight longsword. Okay? That's the sword style. Not unlike how the samurai had their Kenjutsu, their sword fighting, and they had their JiuJitsu, their unarmed fighting. Okay? Yeah. Let's talk about that for a minute. Where did jiu-jitsu come from? If you have a sword, why do you need to grapple? If you have a big long daito katana, as soon as those blades cross, which they almost always do, as soon as they enter a bind, that's when the blades cross, it becomes a grappling situation very, very quickly. And so the samurai, especially since they're already outfitted in armor, and if they do get a hit, it's not necessarily a clean hit. It may just end up blunting their blade, so they have to get in close. It becomes a grappling situation. And the samurai addressed sword fighting differently than the Europeans did, whereas instead of having a single long sword and using it for half-swording, or they would often turn it into a war hammer. I'm going to try to get this on film, and this is kind of weird to do with a Chinese jin as opposed to an English longsword. The English longsword had, a hilt, a crossbar that was capable of being used as a war hammer. So they would grab the blade like this and swing it to hit with the heavy part against an armored knight quite often. And this is something I've never seen in those M1 fights. M1 knight fights, they just try to use a blade as a baseball bat, which is kind of dumb. But often they do enter into grappling situations. They throw each other on the ground. But more often than not, they just stand up. So the samurai had three different swords. They had the daito katana, the long sword, the wakazishi, the medium-sized sword, and then the tanto, the short dagger, basically. And when you get into a bind, you get into a grappling situation, you get into a clinch, you can't use the long daito katana or even the wakazishi, so they'd pull out the tanto and then stab that between the cracks in the armor. Now, obviously, we are not going to see people stabbing each other in the armpits and cutting each other behind the knees in M1 global night fights. But it would be really interesting if we could have some realistic amalgamation of that without people dying. So it's a really fun idea, but the execution of it just turns into something that is really far removed from the historical reality. So, historical martial arts nerds, let me know what you think of those M1 Global night fights in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.